Thank you for listening to Dream 10X Radio, where we interview people attempting to live extraordinary lives. Our twofold purpose is to both direct and inspire people bold enough to do the same. Dream 10X. Face your fears and make your life count. Our next guest put together a project to stand up paddleboard the entire length of the Chesapeake Bay, from Havre de Grace up there at the very top of the bay in Maryland, all the way down to the Virginia Beach area facing the Atlantic Ocean, right there where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Chesapeake Bay. That's about a 203-mile journey, and it took him about 9 days to cover that entire length of the bay. And in our interview with him, you'll find out more of the details of what it took to actually get it done. Please welcome our interview with Chris Hopkinson. I read about your project, I think it was last week, in the Chesapeake Bay Journal, and I was really intrigued by that, and so I thought I'd reach out to you and see if you'd mind telling us a little bit about it. And so I appreciate you joining us this afternoon. Before we get going, I was just wondering if you could just introduce yourself to us and tell us a little bit about who you are, where you grew up, what you do, that kind of thing, your family.
Yeah, so I'm Chris Hopkinson. I guess I'm now known as the Bait Paddler, having just completed the first ever successful attempt stand-up paddleboarding all 200 miles of the Chesapeake Bay. I live right outside of Annapolis in Arnold with my wife and 3 kids who are almost 15, 13, and 10. So we got a high schooler, a middle schooler, and elementary schooler, all Zoom schooling, which is interesting. Yeah, it's harder. I wish I was paddling. It was much easier being on the bay than dealing with homeschooling. Yeah, so I actually grew up here as well. So I grew up in Annapolis. Have pretty much lived here my whole life. I did spend some time in DC and in Baltimore City for a while. So I've definitely grown up in and around the Bay for 46 years now.
Wow. Very cool. What do you do professionally?
I work for a company called Ready Education. We're a mobile app platform for higher ed institutions. So we work with about 350 colleges as their campus app. So like if the University of Maryland had a school branded app, we would potentially be, the platform powering it.
Cool. What does that do, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, I mean, everything. So students can check their courses, grades, pay bills, campus events, activities, join clubs and groups, chat with other students, like everything that, all us old schoolers had to do in person, they can now do with their thumbs and fingers.
Sweet. And how long have you been doing that kind of thing?
I've been doing it for a while, so about 13 years, I guess. Only about half of it was in the higher ed space, but it was a company that started 13 years ago.
Oh, okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what was the genesis of this project to I guess, stand up paddleboard over the course of about 9 days, I guess, over 200 miles, the entire length of the Chesapeake Bay?
Yeah. So honestly, so let me sort of set the stage. Like, I'm no expert paddleboarder by any means, and I had no ambitions or goals of like proving myself by paddleboarding the entire length of the Chesapeake Bay. I got into paddleboarding probably, I can't remember now, either 4 or 6 years ago. My wife bought me a big old, paddleboard just to kind of get me out of the house, probably. And, she was nice enough at the time to include some life jackets. So that meant I had to take the kids with me. So, I mean, paddleboarding for me really was just a way to get on the water. Even though I grew up around the bay and everything, like most people, I didn't own a boat. And so, really had very limited access to the water until I got a paddleboard. And even when I did have the board, most of the time it was just, going a couple miles, very recreational. A lot of times the kids were with me on the front, so it ended up being like a swim platform more than a paddleboard. I would do it, really just to get out of the house. I'm definitely somebody who likes to be moving around. The oyster part and really the genesis of the bay paddle started because I found out that a single oyster can filter 50 gallons of water per day, which I had no idea. And growing up around here, never knew what an oyster really did other than serve as a good appetizer. Um, my daughter at the time, who was 12, we did a science fair experiment for I think her sixth grade class. So we had a 20-gallon fish tank. We filled it up with really murky Magothy River water, which is kind of near where we live off the bay. And we bought a dozen oysters from Annapolis Seafood Market. And, you know, the water was so dark, you could barely tell, and it was a small tank, you could barely tell there was even oysters in it. And after about 3 to 4 hours, you could see your hand clear across the other side. So
No way.
it was amazing to see the oysters at work. And so
Huh,
I
that's
kind of
cool.
started reading up on oysters a little bit. Obviously everybody hears about the health of the bay, and it's not doing that great, and it's always got like a failing score or a C score or whatever it might be. Um, and the reality is the oyster population is down 99%. So to me, it just seems like a really good connection that if we have more oysters in the bay would be healthier. And it really seemed like a good story that everybody could understand, right? Wow, a single oyster filters 50 gallons of water. And I bet if we did a fundraiser and, got people to donate, we could put a lot of oysters back in the bay. And so the idea of the paddle started there. How could I do something that would draw a lot of attention and awareness to Oyster Recovery Partnership, which is the nonprofit that I partnered with, and ultimately put a lot of oysters back in the bay?
I love how seeing that simple experiment unfold before your eyes was that hit so close to home for you.
It was amazing. We actually have like on the baypaddle.org website, and you can like YouTube search them, but there are other time lapse videos of oysters and fish tanks cleaning the water. So, that watching it, we watched it. We didn't stare at it for 3 hours, but the tank was in our kitchen, and you could literally see like the oysters kind of bubbling and opening up their shells, and seeing it firsthand was very eye-opening for me. And honestly, like most people I talk to, or even now that the paddle is over, so many people come up to me and are like, I had no idea what an oyster did, right? Just like I had no idea what they do, or how important they are to the bay. And so, the whole goal here, so far we've raised $180,000, which will put 18 million oysters in the bay. The goal is 200,000. We're continuing to do obviously fundraising, but some events throughout the year, because a $10 donation puts 1,000 oysters in the bay. And so $10 in some ways will ultimately help filter 50,000 gallons of water. And that to me is just a really good return on a fairly small donation.
I had not heard that the bay had lost 99% of its oysters.
Yeah, so like the crab population and like the rockfish population, which people always are kind of paying attention to, they're actually doing pretty well. I mean, it's certainly not as good as it used to be, but they're nowhere near the deficit of the oyster population. The oyster population it's gone. And the crabs, the fish, and the grasses, they actually, like the oysters are kind of the heart of the bay. They're the ones that kind of create the environment for those crabs and fish and grasses to all thrive. And so without them, everything is going to eventually get as depleted as the oysters. And so I've just kind of now become a really big fan of oysters. Obviously, I spent, almost 60 hours paddling the bay just to raise more money and awareness for them. And it was the by far the most fun, the best journey, the hardest thing and that I've ever done. I was so grateful, even though I had like hypothermia, I had sunburn, I was getting thrown all over the bay. But I was so grateful to experience the bay the way that I did.
Are the oyster, the population decreased, you may not know this, but because of overfishing?
It's harvesting yeah, it definitely started that way. So like I don't remember how long ago, but there was like oyster wars in the 1800s, and we definitely over harvested the
Okay.
population. And over time that contributed to the decline. But now also it's kind of like the circle of life, so to speak. Like the oysters have declined, the water's gotten polluted. In some cases, the water is not like it's not healthy enough to even raise oysters. So that's been part of it too. It's been harvesting and some, pollution.
So really creating the whole ecosystem and this positive physical environment for oysters and for humans through the water.
Yeah, exactly. It's the oysters need themselves to remain healthy and to continue to increase the population. They also need us to donate money. I mean, more than anything else.
So I guess the assumption is there that the oysters we are putting back in there are doing okay, as long as they don't get
They
sick.
are, and like through like oyster recovery partnership, which is who I work with. Like they create reefs that can't be harvested. So like they're protected reefs that they're doing. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's good to know.
Cindy loves oysters, so she's part of the problem.
I do, but I don't eat bay oysters. I eat West Coast.
So it's that's an interesting dilemma. So like a lot like oyster recovery actually works with about 300 restaurants, and so ironically they need recycled oyster shells in order to grow healthy oyster spat, which are basically like tiny oyster baby fragments. So they don't like lobby against harvesting or eating oysters because they need the shells. And so the shells are what create the reefs for the spats to start to grow. So right now they work really hard on recycling, and then again, like wherever they're planting oyster, those are protected reefs.
Interesting. So Oyster Recovery Partnership was who you partnered with. Or are there other oyster recovery nonprofits out there doing similar things?
I'm sure there are. I mean, ORP here, they're like the boots in the water. So a lot of times when other larger nonprofit organizations, bay organizations need to put oysters in the bay, they use ORP to do it. So they're definitely like literally the boots in the water, planting and doing all the oyster reefs.
I listened to one podcast interview with you last week, and the interviewer insinuated several times he thought you were crazy for doing this. And the thought never crossed my mind that what you were doing is crazy. Yeah, it's great. It's awesome. Why do you think some people think something like what you did, spending 9 days out on the water, covering 240 miles on a stand-up paddleboard, or 200, how many ever miles? Why is that crazy to some people?
Yeah, I mean, so it hadn't been done before. And it is, and most people, I mean, most like, more than 99% have never on any vessel or anything else traveled the length of the bay. There are a lot of boats that can't do it, right? Like you wouldn't go traveling the length of the bay probably on anything smaller than a 26-foot powerboat, and in some conditions that those wouldn't be good out there either. So I think folks who are really familiar with the bay and the types of conditions that we could see out there, and I experienced all of them, understand how difficult a task it is, and that it might there's a chance. I heard it from folks, and I definitely thought it after the first day that, hey, this might actually not be possible, because I picked the wrong week to go out. Like it just, I've been training for about a year and a half, paddling on the bay, in all kinds of conditions, and I just so happened to get the week where it was like 10 to 15 plus knot winds for like 5 straight days, which meant like 2 to 3 foot swells. And like I had never seen the bay, and I know it's happened before, but I had never seen it like that. And in most cases, be honest, like if it was blowing 15 plus knots, I would, in training, I'd be like, yeah, I'm not going out there today. It's a little too risky for me, especially because most of the time in my training, I'm by myself. There's nobody with me, no boat support or anything. So I think a lot of folks realize, like, hey man, the conditions out there can be extremely challenging. Around here, they can change within a couple hours. You got hurricane season, you got summer season, you got winds one direction in the morning, a totally different direction in the afternoon. You got afternoon thunderstorms. There's just so many things that can happen out on the bay. I think the reason that no one had done it before is because they thought it was too crazy, or maybe I think crazy was probably just a polite way of calling me stupid, which is fine, right? I just, I think my naivety towards the bay and paddling it was what worked for me. Not knowing what to expect was what made it, in my mind, seem possible.
And get you out there doing it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a year and a half to train for that. What did you do? What was your training regimen like?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I was a recreational paddler, and then I had this crazy idea. And so I was like, well, I got to start figuring out how I'm going to pull this off. And so last year, almost this time exactly, at the end of October in 2019, I did a race called Chattajack, which is in Chattanooga, and it's a 31.8 mile paddleboard race. And actually most of the folks who do that race are kayakers or outriggers or canoes. And there's, maybe 100, 125 SUPs. And so I started training for that last summer by paddling up and down the bay, going from, the Magathie to the Patapsco, which is up near Baltimore, or the Magathie to the Severn down in Annapolis and back, and really doing some pretty, 15 to 25 mile paddles on the bay. That was kind of my first experience in those types of conditions on the bay and doing those types of distances. And I really just wanted to get a sense of, like, what's this going to take and what's going to break down first? Like, what part of my body am I going to start to have to really be concerned about? And did that fine. I'm so glad I did it because it did give me a good sense of paddling and what it would take. And I found out, okay, it's your legs that you need the most. They take the brunt of paddling, even though folks would be arms and back. And I did end up having some elbow issues, which carried over to this year. And so in March, I worked with an organization called Paddle Monster, and one of their pro female paddlers. In fact, I think she's the number one pro female in the world. Her name is Seychelle Webster. She ended up really volunteering to be my coach because she supported what I was doing. And I worked with her on like a 22-week training program that she put together. And that's what ultimately kind of got me physically ready to paddle the bay.
Cool.
So, all right, your physical training, and then what about your mental training? I mean, these are long, arduous days, and seeing the same things over and over again. And how did you keep your spirits up, and how did you train mentally for this?
Yeah, so great question, and a couple things. One is, like, I don't have any sort of superpowers or endurance or whatever it might be. No great athlete, and I was not a great paddler. I do think that I do have the ability, because people ask me all the time, like, oh my gosh, 7, 8, 9 hours on a paddleboard, what are you thinking about? And, like, for some reason, I'm almost like a Seinfeld, episode. Like, I can think about nothing for 7 hours and be good.
Oh my God, that's brilliant.
So it's a common, it's great when you're paddling, maybe not so great when you're trying to parent and be a good husband, but I can just go back and be perfectly content. So in that area, I was good. I will say that, and this was completely unexpected, and it's made it really hard to come down off of this paddle, is I just got so much support from our community, like hundreds of texts and social media and email and everything. Just people saying, like, this is unbelievable. I think we got a lot of press beforehand, and people were supporting it. But once I got on the water, and people, especially around here, saw the conditions I was in, and Oyster Recovery did a really good job of like documenting how I was doing each day, and I would try to post some videos. I got so many messages that people are like, "Oh my gosh, man, you are such an inspiration. Keep doing, like, just keep going." It was just keep moving forward. All those messages, and that really lifted me up. I remember I had one particularly bad day. I had two really bad days, but one towards the end. It was the only day where we didn't make it to our destination. So we always had a goal destination in mind. On this day, it was super windy. Normally we'd be going about 4 miles an hour, and the wind was so bad we were doing about under 2.5. So it took over 7 hours to go 17 miles, and I was just getting beaten up. And it was 5 o'clock, and I had 50 more miles to go to finish it. And it was towards the end, and it was starting to become a real challenge day to day. Like my knees were really starting to bother me early, like at miles like 12 and 15. And I pulled myself from the water and said, I can't go anymore. And that I hated that. And my wife picked me up. She dropped me off, picked me up every day. And on the car ride to the place we were staying that night, our kids were back at home, kind of staying with friends and family, and a couple folks checked in, basically just to say, "Hey, your kids are good." But they were on speakerphone, and they kind of heard I was in the car, and they were like, again, like so supportive. They're like, "Chris, you would not believe everybody's talking about you." And I'm like, okay. And I sort of said to my wife, like, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I have 50 miles to go, but there is no way I'm letting these people down. So drop me off by myself at 7 a.m. and we're just going to bust through this day. And I don't care. We're going to get it done. And so, like, mentally, not being able to go nowhere is a huge advantage. And then, like, the support was just so inspiring to me. And that's what really kept me going. And so, like, coming off of it, as I mentioned, like, I've done 2 Ironmans, and those are great. But it's not like people are like, "Hey, cool, Ironman." I won't ever be able to experience anything like that again, and that's been hard because I'm like, golly, like that. It was 9 days of full focus, so busy all the time. When I wasn't paddling, I was actively recovering or trying to figure out where we're going next, or looking at the wind, or whatever it might be. And it was just nonstop. And then, I was getting all these messages from everybody, and then literally it was over, and it was like, I'm checking email, and then I'm back on Zoom calls. I'm like, golly, like what a crash. Like,
Yeah.
To go from that to back to reality. I mean, I'm almost making it like a mission of mine now, just to randomly reach out to some of my friends and be like, I don't know what you're going through, dude, but you got it. Like, just keep going, whatever it is. And I know it's gonna probably miss all the time. Like, they're gonna be like, I don't know, I was just brushing my teeth and Chris sent me a message to just keep going. But I just feel like we need that right now. Like, even people were kind of reaching out to me and saying, like, it was so much fun to have a good distraction. It wasn't COVID, and it wasn't an election. It was just watching some guy get the crap beat out of him for a good cause. And I wish there was more ways we could do that. So I'm trying to figure that out now, is like, how do I create that environment for more people?
Yeah. Can you take us back to more about your experience out on the water? So that first day you experienced some headwinds, and you were apparently feeling like, well, I bit off way more than I can chew. How did you push through that and continue? And then also, can you talk about a little bit what it was like out there on the whole?
Yeah, the first day was the worst and hardest. And we started in Havre de Grace, which is the northern end of the Chesapeake Bay. So the top of the Chesapeake Bay. We changed the course completely 3 days before it started. So I was supposed to go down the western shore. So, like, kind of getting near Baltimore and Annapolis and St. Mary's City, and down the western shore. And the way the weather turned forced me over to the eastern shore. So when I was talking about the 10 to 15 plus knot winds, they were all coming from the northeast for like 5 straight days. And so if I had gone down the western shore with a northeast wind, and east is, when the wind from the northeast hits the bay and you're on the western shore, there's nothing to block it. It just is rolling across the bay right at you. I would have ended up paddling, just getting pounded, forced into the shoreline and paddling on my right side for 7 hours to keep from being blown off the bay. So I moved to the eastern shore to get some protection, so I can kind of, go up against the shoreline and get a little bit of protection from the wind. That first day in Havre de Grace is beautiful, and the water up there is super clear because it's more fresh. It's coming off the Susquehanna, so there's less salinity. You can see a ton of grasses. The visibility is like 6 to 8 feet. You can see the fish below you. It's amazing. And so I was actually super excited. I had trained up there. I knew what the conditions were like. You get a little bit of a current off the Susquehanna kind of pumping into the bay. And I was really confident. I'm like, this is going to be great. First day, perfect area to start. Here we go. And the conditions that day were just the worst. They were 15 plus knot winds, sometimes gusting to 20, small craft advisory, which means, basically they're saying like any boat less than 22 feet, I think, is advised not to be on the water. And I'm on a 14-foot paddleboard. 3-foot waves. And I was just getting really badly beaten. And on top of that, I was trying to hug the shoreline a little bit. And it just so happened that morning they were practicing artillery rounds at Aberdeen Proving Grounds, which is a military base. And when they do that, they put patrol boats about 500 yards, maybe more, off the shoreline, and you can't get anywhere near the shoreline. So those patrol boats were like, get away from here. And so we kind of were, I had a kayaker with me for most of the way. So we were kind of stuck out near the middle of the bay, just getting literally thrown down and across the bay. And at one point I was like, all right, I can't take this anymore. Like, we got to get over to the other side and just deal with it, because at least if it's, we'll get some wind behind us going across, and then we'll just have to figure it out. But we need to get closer to the shoreline. It'll break up the waves a little bit. And so, I went across the shoreline. In training, in 22 weeks of training, 4 days a week on a paddleboard, just in the water all the time, I maybe fell in 8 times over the course of those 5.5 months. That first day I fell in probably 15 times. And on one of them, I had Towboat US was one of our partners. And so they actually had a towboat following me the whole time, which provided some good visibility, and they know their waters really well. And then I'd have 1 to 2 support boats, usually buddies of mine, that were also providing kind of guidance and support. And on that first day, we started to cross the bay to get over to the eastern shore, and I fell in again. I got back on my board. I didn't notice anything, but I was shaking uncontrollably. And it just so happened right at that time that the support boat was right next to me. Normally they'd be like 50 to 100 yards off because I'm in shallow water, but I was across in the middle of the bay at this point. And there also just so happened to be an EMT on the boat who I didn't know, but he was like, whoa, dude, why are you shaking so much? Are you cold? I'm like, no, I'm good. And he's like, all right, well, what day is it? I'm like, it's today. And he's like, yeah, it's not the answer we're looking for. We need to get you off the water. So they put me on the boat for probably 30 minutes, like stripped me out all my wet clothes, got dry clothes on, and just sat there and warmed up. And then I got back on the board and finished over in Rock Hall, which was about 33 miles and took almost 8 hours. But like the falling in, the shivering, the hypothermia, like I had never felt more exhausted physically or mentally when I was done that day. Like that was a day where, I said to my wife, I might be in over my head on this. We're 33 miles in. I've never felt like this before, and we have 180 plus miles to go.
How did you know where you were going to stay every night? Did you stay in a hotel room or somebody's house?
We really didn't. Yeah. So because we changed kind of the course at the last minute for the wind, it was really day by day. So the first couple days I stayed home, but that meant I was, my wife would pick me up. We drive almost an hour and a half back home. The next day, hour and a half back to the same location. just because we really, in some cases on the Eastern Shore, part of the problem is there's not a lot of places to stay, and access to the water is harder to get to.
Mm.
So as we kind of, and each day it was really hard to figure out where I was going. So the paddle ended up being a lot more tactical, which made like logistics hard. So like I would be done the first day, and then I'd be immediately on my phone looking at Wind Finder and looking at maps and trying to figure out, all right, based on tomorrow's wind conditions, where can we get to? And I need to get to a place that when we finish, we're in a favorable spot for the following day based on those wind conditions. So like every day I was just kind of navigating maps and wind direction and everything else tied, and kind of determining last minute, like here's where we might end up, but it could be shorter, it could be longer, but this is our goal. And logistically that made things hard. So like, we'd kind of last minute at a Holiday Inn. One night we got super lucky and stayed. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation has a place called the Karen Noonan Center in Crocheron. We stayed there one night. Had a buddy who has a place near Deal Island, stayed there one night. So we were kind of all over the place. And so we were, that was part of it too. Like, you're going down the bay, you're in a different spot every day, staying in a different place every night. In some ways that was obviously super hard logistically, but that also made it like, when I talked about just being on the go all the time, like there was very little downtime between days because we were usually traveling, had a ton of crap to pack, food, nutrition, supplements, board, all the gear for the board. So every day it was kind of packing, unpacking, packing, unpacking. And even at night, it was like super hard to come down. Like just, it's hard to explain. Like you're tired, but you have a lot to do because you got to plan for the next day, and it was just hard to like unwind.
Did you carry all your stuff, all your supplies on the board, or did your support boats help out with that?
It was both. So what I would do is I'd carry like a half a day's worth with me. So one Camelback with about 70 ounces of electrolytes, 2 to 3 protein bars, 2, I call them Ironman sandwiches, but only because I just ate them during an Ironman. And then that would be kind of like my first half of the day. And then I'd roll over to the support boat and just swap it all out. Brand new Camelback, fully loaded, new bars, new sandwiches, everything ready to go.
What's in an Ironman sandwich?
Yeah, so the Ironman sandwiches, I use gluten-free bread, usually sun butter or peanut butter, cinnamon, honey, and bananas. That's my Ironman sandwich.
Okay.
That's the beauty of those types of sandwiches. Like they can get smashed up, they can get dry, anything can happen to them, and it doesn't really affect it. So I could carry an Ironman sandwich for 4 hours. Unfortunately, on the water, like it was hard to keep them dry. So I often had like some soggy sandwiches, but that was part of the fun.
And for fluids, any kind of special mixes or anything like that?
Yeah, a lot of electrolytes, and a lot of I use a amino powder from Kion. It's Kion Aminos. So I had usually like 4 or 5 water bottles with aminos in it, and then the Camelbacks, which were about 70 ounces each, were electrolytes.
Okay. What about tracking? How did you manage that? Was it live tracking, or was it after the fact?
Yeah.
You go home and update a map or something, or?
No, it was live. So I have a Sunto watch that tracked it live, and then I had it's from NK Sports. It's basically called a SUP trainer. It's almost like, have you ever seen like those bike computers that cyclists have? It's it's actually a bigger version of that attaches to the front of my board and has a satellite signal. So that would track speed, time, distance. It has heart rate on it, and then my watch was tracking speed, time, distance, heart rate, and then actually I had my phone on as well. So I was using Map My Tracks to do it live so folks could kind of follow me.
So all of that stuff would somehow feed into that website?
So My Tracks was basically an app that was feeding to the website, and then my Sunto watch I used, like I would take snapshots of that from, I'd kind of sync it to the website and take a snapshot so folks could see, like, that was a really easy way to see, like, calories burned, time, distance, average speed, elevation, and then it also would show, like, power output, recovery time. I think, like, that was kind of the funny thing is, like, the Sunto watch is doing my heart rate, and anytime you do an exercise, it says, oh, here's your recovery time for this activity. And, like, every day it would say, you need 120 hours to recover from today. I'm like, oh, great. Well, I got to go back at it in 12 hours. So I don't have 4 days to 5 days to recover.
Did you see any container ships or anything like that out there?
We saw a few. That was kind of funny too. So we would see eagles every day, like 2 to 3 eagles a day, almost to the point where it was like, yeah, all kinds of bald eagles. Yeah. I mean, they're pretty. There's a pretty good population on the bay, and I don't know if it was because of the time of the year. We saw a lot of them. Probably where I was on the water 9 days, we definitely saw 15. Almost to the point where it was like, oh, bald eagle, okay. Like, it was so, like, it's like seeing a pigeon. We saw some ships. I mean, we weren't in the shipping channel. The shipping channel is like the middle of the bay. I actually saw a lot more ships when I was training, just because I just based on where I can get in the water, I was really more closer to the shipping channel. The funny thing was, like, I mean, what I saw, like, the bay is spectacular, and I saw places that I'd never heard of that I'm now in love with, like the Honga River, Fishing Creek, Tar Bay. Like, I just had a very unique perspective. People have gone up and down the bay in boats, but usually they're in the middle of the bay, and most of the time I was 50 to 100 yards off the shoreline, which helped because we could see the eagles. But just being that close, and in some areas where boats can't get because it's shallow, it was amazing. I have so much appreciation for how spectacular the bay is. And again, a lot of these places, like Claiborne, which is near St. Michael's, Claiborne Landing, beautiful spot off of Eastern Bay, Taylor Island, Slaughter Creek, never heard of any of these places. Honga River was by far my favorite spot. It's like, and a lot of these places kind of south of St. Michael's it's like they've been undiscovered. I mean, untouched for the last 50 years and almost undiscovered. I kind of felt like Captain Smith out there, like, exploring the bay. Nobody around, no development, just trees, beautiful river, bay water, and it was just amazing. And on one of those runs, and my wife, she'd see me every day and kind of knew the condition I was in, but we went down Taylor's Island one day along the shoreline. It was spectacular. We took this little narrows called Fishing Creek, and we got on the Honga River. And I texted my wife. I was like, I'm having so much fun today. Like, it is unbelievably beautiful here. And then, of course, 4 hours later, I was dying because it was a 26-mile day and I was exhausted. But other than, like, eagles and, like, some fish and crabs and just the natural beauty, it wasn't till, which I sort of felt like the eagles were our guide. That was kind of like, God's way of saying, like, you're on the right path. And then ironically, like, people had seen dolphins way up north this season. I don't know if there's a reason for it, but, like, north of the Bay Bridge, and, sharks up here. And so I was expecting to see something, especially because we were usually going out pretty early in the morning, and, we'd seen nothing. And I'm like, 2 miles from the Atlantic Ocean, hadn't seen anything. And sure enough, like, maybe 100 yards from me, these 3 dolphins breach. And so I paddled towards them. Then they went underneath my board and they breached on the other side. And it was unbelievable. And I had a filmmaker following me the whole time. So there's going to be a documentary on this whole adventure. And awesome. She was like, Chris, this whole thing just became about dolphins. Like, that was unbelievable to see. And so I kind of felt like, at the end there, like, that was kind of like the final, like, blessing, like to have these dolphins, to get so close to them and have them jump out of the water 2 miles from the finish that was all I needed. It was amazing.
Wow, you go from starting out to wondering what the heck you were getting yourself into and experiencing hypothermia and all that, and then to go through all 9 days and then have an experience like that makes it all worth it, doesn't it?
100%. I mean, I can't wait to, I've already talked to some buddies of mine. I'm like, let's go do parts of this again. And I've talked to like the Maryland Department of Tourism about, making the route. I mapped out 2 routes, Western Shore, Eastern Shore, like kind of promoting it as almost like an Appalachian Trail. If people want to paddle or kayak, here are different routes they can take. Here's where they can stay. And I'll probably do one more long paddle this year, and then next spring I'll definitely get back out and repeat some of the days that I had, like that Taylor Island Honga River run was just amazing. It's super remote, and so I'm sure I'll get back down there. And then everything near Cape Charles. Cape Charles is really, really cool town on the really southern part of the bay, probably 30 to 40 minutes north of Virginia Beach. Super cool spot. I'll definitely paddle back there again.
Yeah, there's so much history on the bay and in the rivers as well. Be interesting to correlate all that.
Well, that was part of it too. So like outside of Cape Charles, there's a state park called Kipto Peak. And so there are, I think it's 9, but I might be wrong, 9 cement ships from World War II. They were supply ships that they sunk, and they're concrete. They use concrete ships for these supply ships. They're sunk in there, and now they're just reefs. And so like, I paddled right through them, like seeing like, there's certainly a lot of, Native American history and environmental history, and then just U.S. history and everything else in the bay. And then you see like World War II stuff. I was just like blown away. Like this place is just so the whole bay. It really is. The bay is our Grand Canyon, and it may not be marketed as such, but it is as spectacular, and more people need to be aware of it. And how amazing it is. The problem is it's harder. Like when I mentioned before, I never had a boat, so the paddleboard was my first time on the water. It's just harder to access. So, but there's plenty of places to go to, state parks, that you can enjoy the bay as much as I did. And I'm gonna try my best to like bring more attention to areas like the Honga River and Cape Charles and Kipto Peak State Park and Claiborne Landing, and there's another park called Elk Neck State Park and Crisfield, that to me were just really, really amazing parts of the bay that very few people get to.
That's great. Was there that kind of segues to my other question about where is it? I wrote it down. Any other big surprises about this whole adventure that you weren't kind of expecting?
Well, I think the two were, the tactical part of it. So, we had this route planned out and mapped out, and we knew where we were going and where we were staying and all that kind of stuff. And that all changed, right, just because of conditions. And so on a day-to-day basis, not only did I really not know where I was going, but I had to really like strategically figure out destinations based on conditions that day and then also the conditions the following day. So that was a lot more work than I expected. And then again, like all the support, I didn't really know what to expect there. Or if, I thought we'd raise a lot of money and awareness, but I didn't expect people to like get behind me, so to speak, and cheer me on. That was really inspirational for me.
We interviewed a guy two episodes ago who sailed single-handedly from Berlin, or not Berlin, but the UK, all the way down to Australia with a overland crossing the United States. And he had a great comment that stuck with me, where he had the opportunity to either fly home, which was about a 12-hour flight, or to experience every point in between where he needed to go. And that's kind of what I'm hearing in your adventure as well, as a profound appreciation for all the points in between Le Havre and down there. And where'd you end up again?
Cape Charles.
Cape Charles.
Yeah.
Yeah, just south of Cape Charles. So yeah, it was Havre de Grace all the way down to the Atlantic Ocean. I went off of Fisherman's Inlet, was kind of the last point of land, and then I went around there and into the Atlantic. So yeah, no, 100%. So, I mean, I think, everybody's heard of Annapolis and Baltimore and probably St. Michael's and Easton and Cambridge and some of the more popular places. And those are all beautiful spots, but it was the ones that I had never heard of. I'd heard of Cape Charles, but I'd never been there. I'd never even heard of the Honga River. I didn't know what it was. And even people who are avid boaters who I talked to about it were like, I've never heard of the Honga River either. Like those places are where you're like, it was just the surprise of it, where you're like, wow, like how was this not on like my radar at all? And the reason is because why would it be, right? Like the only way to see it is like your other guest mentioned, is to go from point to point and not skip over from one place to another.
Yeah, on a slow moving craft.
Yeah.
Non-motorized.
Very slow moving. Exactly.
Cindy and I were thinking about doing something similar next year, and we were thinking about maybe rowing down the Potomac or rowing the bay or something like that. We were just wondering if you had any advice you might be willing to share with us to prepare for something like that.
Well, the Potomac's long. That's no easy task. So, rowing it'd be easier than paddling for sure. The biggest thing is just going to be tide. So you want to go at high tide because you want to catch the current going out. So if you're paddling down the Potomac and it's high tide, you start at max high tide. The water's going to start, the current's going to start to shift down going out of the bay. And so having that current is really key. It's almost like when you're at the airport and you get on that conveyor belt, that walking conveyor belt, that's the current with you. And when you get off of it, that's the current against you, right? You don't notice it until it's not there. And so that was something that we had to pay attention to every day, was when is high tide. Usually it was the week that we were doing it, it was usually pretty early in the morning. So we'd want to catch high tide. And then on the Potomac, you're gonna be looking for wind, like like an east wind would not be good for you on the Potomac, because that's going to be like a headwind. You could duck along the shorelines to get away from a north wind. You can duck along the other shoreline to get away from the south wind. A little bit. That the Potomac snakes a little bit. So you just need to watch. The tide's the biggest thing, because you can control that. Wind you can't. I would say pick a week if you're just kind of like doing it on a whim, like just pick a week where the wind conditions look favorable.
Cool. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So what can
and the other thing I would say about that too, by the way, is that the mouth of the Potomac and the Chesapeake Bay, that is some rough water.
Yeah.
So that's pretty. It's 10 miles across the Potomac.
You went by
at that point.
Through that straight, didn't you?
I was on the other side, but originally I was supposed to go, and I think is it Point Lookout? I think it's Point Lookout. Yeah, Point Lookout State Park is kind of the northern side of the Potomac. So that was going to be one of my runs, crossing the Potomac and getting over into Virginia. And everybody I talked to is like, that is you got current. The problem when you get down there is two currents meet. You have a current coming out of the Potomac and you have a current coming down the bay. And so it ends up being like a washing machine right there.
That sounds fun.
Yeah.
Maybe we turn around before we get to that. What can you recommend that average people watching your adventure do to continue to support the bay now that your project is over?
Yep. So, they can go to baypaddle.org and they can donate there. $10 puts 1,000 oysters in the bay. You can text Bay Paddle to 44321, and that also can donate there. We actually have Bay Paddle gear, so trucker hats and T-shirts that also support oyster recovery. And then the documentary will be out. I think the filmmaker, it's going to take her a couple of weeks probably towards the end of the year. It'll be a short, 40-minute film. I will put together a race next summer, probably based on one of the days from the paddle. So it'll be a 20 to 30 mile race for, any paddler, outrigger, kayak, canoe, stand up, whatever it might be. And I'll try to pick kind of one of my favorite locations, or at least maybe a location that I think people would really enjoy paddling.
That's awesome.
So that'll be something that will happen next year.
Cool. That is very cool. Have you ever heard of the Y Island Regatta?
No.
Oh, you should totally do that.
You should look into that if you're interested. It's around Y Island in Delaware, I think it is. Is that
Yeah,
Delaware?
I think it's
Maryland?
Delaware.
It's Delaware?
I think so.
No,
Or
Y
no, it's
Island,
Maryland. No, it's Maryland. Yeah. It's a super fun race, and they have stand-up paddle boards as well as rowing. And you do 12 miles around kayaking, yeah, and you do 12 miles around the island, and they have obviously different heats based on what kind of boat you have, and it's just a really, really fun race, lots of camaraderie. You'd probably really dig it.
That's cool. Yeah, I'm looking at their site now. Yeah, that's fun. I'll definitely take a look at that. Yeah, that was one of the things too. There's a really good paddling community here in Maryland, and there are not a lot of paddling races. And like for a lot of the kayaks or outriggers or ocean kayaks, like they need a good long distance run. Like a 10 or 12 mile ride is not. It's good, but it's they're moving faster than the SUPs. If you want to like the days that I had were marathon days, right? 7 hours on the water, 20 to 30 miles. Like that would be a good 4-hour kayak for sure. And I think that's what folks want to do. And the Chattajack one that I talked about, like most of the paddlers are outriggers and ocean kayaks. They're not SUPs because it's a point to point. So you're not turning around. You're just blasting straight the whole time, which makes it fun for those folks too, because it's just easier to navigate in a straight line.
I guess our final question for you then is, are there any books that you have read recently that you'd like to recommend?
Yes. There are some books that I'm just pulling up my Kindle right now because I read all the time. So I just read It Takes What It Takes, which is Trevor Moawad, I think his name is, and it's really about the mental aspect of athlete training. Russell Wilson is in that book. I've read The Obstacle Is the Way, Ryan Holiday. I like a lot of Ryan Holiday's books. That was a really good one. So those two are ones that I recently read. I read It Takes What It Takes like right before the paddle because I really wanted to get myself kind of mentally in a good place where, it takes what it takes, just kind of the mindset of like, whatever happens, good or bad, it doesn't really matter. There's no reaction to it either way. You just keep going. The Obstacle of the Way is, if you've read that one by Ryan Holiday, it's more about like, there is no easy way, right? You have to get through the obstacle, whatever it is, in order to get to where you want to go. And so, I think the paddle was a really good metaphor for like life in general, right? The only thing that went according to plan was that we started on the day that we said we were going to start, and we finished on the day that we said we were going to finish. And that was it. Every day was totally unplanned, and I had no idea what was going to happen. I couldn't control the conditions. I couldn't control the weather. I really couldn't control I could do everything I could in terms of diet and recovery and sleep to control how my body's going to feel, but I was putting it through something and had never experienced before. So the key to it all was to just keep going, right? And so we started when we said we were going to start, and we finished when we said we were going to finish, and every day in between was hard and different, and I had to deal with different challenges, but I just decided that every day I'm going to wake up and get on my board and see what happens. And ultimately, that's what got me to the finish line, that I just had this mindset of a lot of it came from all the support that I talked about. Like, I'm not going to let these people down. I'm just going to keep going. And at the end of the day, we'll see where we end up.
Yeah.
And fortunately for me, it ended up at, exactly where I wanted to end on the day that I said I would finish. I was just, as I mentioned before, like, it was just such an unbelievable experience for me. I'm like literally trying to figure out, how do I experience something like that again, where someone who shouldn't be able to do this goes and does something that everybody said was impossible. And I just took an enormous leap of faith. I do read the Bible every day, so maybe that's probably the book I should recommend. And yeah, and just got up every day and just decided I was going to move forward. And at the end of the day, it worked out. Not exactly as planned, but it worked out. Maybe better than I could have ever imagined it. And the experience was definitely better than I could have ever envisioned. And so, I don't know, I just have a lot of gratitude, a ton of appreciation for the Bay. And when I finished, and I had no emotion when I finished. Like, I crossed in the Atlantic, I fell into the water, and I had zero emotion. At the finish, when I got back on the boat to get out of the water, and I think part of it was, I just sort of realized in that moment, like, this was the start. This is just like paddling the Bay was now the starting point, or at least finishing the paddle. Like, the mission is to bring more oysters to the Bay, to save the Bay, to make sure that we leave it better than we found it. And I just finished the first part of that mission. So it's almost like I finished, and I'm like, I'm now motivated to do like the next thing for the Bay.
Awesome. Yeah. And let's go put some more oysters in there as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, cool. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking to you.
Yeah, likewise. Good talking to you both. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions. Again, baypaddle.org, place where you can find out more information and donate.